On March 12th, after returning from a trip out of the country, I started playing one of my favorite games, Destiny 2. Destiny is an RPG video game, a role-playing game I like to play in my free time. Since the last time I logged on, a new expansion had come out for the game, bringing new loot, which are items you can equip to your player character, and a new story to experience with it. Yet, what surprised me most was when I began the main quest, I was presented with a choice, whether to side with one character or another, stating that my in-game decisions would have grave consequences down the line. Although I have played games like this before, this was something incredibly new for this game franchise. It got me wondering whether RPGs that allow for narrative choices were now becoming the preferred model of storytelling in video games. To explore this further, I started with some background information and research about narrative storytelling in video games, which led me to 3 amazing professionals with unique insight into the topic. Bob Keane, a production designer and professor at UNCSA School of Filmmaking, teaching production design and leading the school in the field of immersive entertainment. His past experiences also include running marketing campaigns for PlayStation and being a gamer himself. Mitchell Sabbath is an award-winning writer and former QA tester at Bethesda Softworks, credited for his work on Skyrim Special Edition, The Evil Within 2, and Prey Mooncrash. He's also a creative writer, and writes critically on the role of narrative storytelling in video games. Finally, Ashley Rule is a narrative game designer at Gunfire Games, and has been designing memorable moments in games for over 8 years. She's been a creator and a director of story content for games such as Darksiders 3, Tales from the Borderlands, The Walking Dead, The Wolf Among Us, Defiance, and Star Wars The Old Republic. Her work includes the ability to build emotional investment through player interactions and a strong eye for narrative pacing and framing. The primary force for these interviews were to better understand and gain insight into their thoughts on how RPG video games, which allow for branching narratives and player choice, has changed the concept and perception of storytelling by engaging its participants directly into the process.
So you've got many things you've got about there, so let's break this down. First of all, I think it starts off with the fact that you can now make your character look any way you want it to look. So you're not stuck with Mario looking like Mario. You're looking with a system where you can customize your character, and you can make it look in many different ways. And I think that makes an association with your character a lot stronger, and also a feeling of ownership of your character a lot stronger. Then on top of that, you've got the fact that you can explore the world. You can go off and do outer quest games. You can go off and have your own story to tell. You don't have to necessarily go down that story and tell. The moral part, I think, is really interesting, that when there are moral decisions, I love the games that suddenly change the story. If you make a moral decision and you become one kind of character, that can alter the whole rest of the game. Because there's a whole part of the game you may never see because of the decisions you make. And that really makes the playable again value through the roof. You want to go back to the world, you want to go back and explore a different way of going through it. You might want to be a different person this playthrough. And I think the roles you take and the roles you take on become much more interesting.
So the difference between a computer RPG and something a bit more passive like literature and movies is that the participant is not passive. They just don't stand there watching or reading a story. They are part of the story, and because they are an active component of the experience, they can have a say on how things play out. And that can have a sizable impact not just on the quality of the story, but also on how things turn out and how they can shape their own tales.
In narrative design in games, we have to really think about narrative as a dialogue. It can't just be that we're telling a story to the player. We are building a framework for the player to tell their own story. So the choices that we present, the scenarios we create, they have to have enough openness and freedom to allow the player to tell the story that they want to tell, while still fitting into a narrative that is compelling, has great beginning, middle, and end, It's this balance of, I want to create a world where there's definitely a through line for the narrative, but I want to give you enough choice to make it so you can play someone who is more dark side versus light side. You like different characters, or you want to express you don't like this character, or you want to show yourself as noble, or you want to show yourself as mischievous.
Basically, when it comes to important design aspects in an RPGs, besides giving the player the ability to make meaningful choices like in The Witcher 3, the other things have to be taken into account. Credible NPCs whose interest, fears, and history beget innermost interactions with the player that may massively shape the main storyline, and also side storylines that may feed back into the main quest.
I think it always comes down to character relationships and character definition of your protagonist in the game. The through line and the main storyline may not change as much, but what we really hang on to are the relationships. I love Mass Effect. Mass Effect is one of my favorite series. And the thing that I'm always talking about with people years later are the relationships, are the people, and not necessarily, the space opera. The space opera is cool, but it really comes down to the characters. So I think that interactive narrative has this great opportunity to help people sort of build their own stories in these universes and make them feel like, as a player, they really belong to you. They're not just being told at you, you are part of them. But as a narrative designer, you have to create scenarios that give that freedom and don't make players feel like they're being shoehorned into playing a certain way or being a certain person or liking a certain character. You have to keep it loose, but still have direction.
So credible NPCs, creating a content-dense space with multiple opportunities for the player to grow their character. So not just creating an environment, but also kind of creating a playground, a sandbox with multiple innings for the player to leverage in order to create their own fun and kind of root themselves into the world and its inner workings. And then there's also the issue of lore, geography, and cultures that make the player want to be involved. So when you talk about branching narratives, you also have to make those branching narratives interesting. So things like lore, geography, and cultures, like what you see in the Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind. But Morrowind, unlike most RPGs, is this mix of Asian, Middle Eastern, Oriental, and also extraterrestrial elements that beget a unique world the player wants to be involved in. And this also has a lot of effects on not just the narrative, but also kind of the level design. When you're talking about branching narratives, you're not just talking about affecting people and stories. You're also affecting the environment, the physical environment as a whole. Like, when you look at, say, games that are mainly single-player environments, when you create those branching narratives, you can also create this domino effect that can have a sizable impact on the world.
Into that, do you believe that there's a difference between the stories in which we take part in and the ones we watch? And if so, how do you see what are the issues? Because they're all stories in the end, but what really defines them, the two?
Well, I think it's, like I said, I think it's about how much space you feel like you have to tell your own story, to create a character that is unique. Even if it's not necessarily very unique in the grand scheme of things, you want to be able to make it feel like the story you were able to tell was your story. I think the biggest difference between, say, watching a movie about Captain America versus making choices as Captain America is that in the movie version, you're like, oh, I like that character, I'm rooting for that character, whatever. But when you're making the choices, it's like, no, what I did, my actions affected this world, and I feel both proud and responsible for the effect I have on the space.
Freedom, and also a cohesive narrative that is reactive and multi-layered. So active participation, interpersonal interactions that can be put together in ways that surprise the player and keeps them invested into the experience. So those are the two major things that separate RPGs and narrative.
The quest. Yeah. So the quest has to drive you. The quest. There's no point in saying your quest is to go and get some bread and butter. You know, off you go, brave knight. Find me some bread and butter. It's got to be engaging, endearing. You've got to have. There's got to be consequences. There's got to be a degree of growth in your character. You want characters to go better. You want the world to get better or worse. There has to be change. And off change comes conflict, and through conflict becomes interest. So I think there's a lot of the rules that we think don't apply, that we apply to films and narrative stories, actually do apply. You just have to apply them in a different way. You have to look at them a different way. You have to keep your players' interest at all times.
What do you believe are the key elements needed to tell compelling narratives in RPG video games? The characters, the worlds in which players are constantly shaping it by their choices.
So I think it's invisible walls, right? That's the secret to it all. And it sounds like a terrible idea, right? But in fact, you've got to bring back some degree of narrative so that you can introduce and move forwards. Otherwise, you could create a fantastic world, but there's no forward momentum in the world, right? So the trick is to give the player the feeling of freedom, but the power of storytelling still to be coming in, right? And you'll find a lot of games will pick the moment where it's been quiet for a long period of time and everything's sort of got into an easy time, and then suddenly they will kick something off, which will cause a reaction to happen. The storytellers themselves have to think differently. You have to think that some of your storytellings will not ever be seen by some players. Only some players may fall down that hole and move through the caves and meet the characters that are down there and explore with those. So you have to write an awful lot more for a video game than you do for a film. A film would be, say, 90 pages, and a video game could be 800 to 1,000 pages.
For me, character is one of the strongest things because you need to be able to empathize. You need to be able to feel connected to the characters in a way that is relatable, that you can say, oh, well, I've never been in a zombie apocalypse, but I can relate to this relationship between these two characters who are going through a hard thing together.
Yeah.
If you can abstract it away from the scenario and the emotions that they are expressing towards one another are relatable, then you can connect more with the story.
Like creating interesting enemies that aren't just enemies, but also kind of rivals and their own unique bosses. You really want to get into the minutia of the NPCs in order to create multiple confluences of outcomes and events that can be combined to create different kinds of world states and values that will compel the player to either change their playstyle or trudge on with them, or compel them to explore different parts of the world that they may not have impacted yet, or if they want to remain in a particular part of the world in order to fix things that they have caused, or in order to further their goals, which they have partially achieved.
I think what you have to balance is you have to balance out quantity over quality. Okay, you don't want there to be so much world that it's absolutely fantastic, but the quality is not enough, right? So the quality of storytelling, the quality of presentation, the quality of the characters themselves that you interact with has to be of the highest standard. I think we can't do games anymore where the voice talent doesn't really sell the game. You know, it's interesting to see that big name actors now, or very good character actors, are landing a lot of parts in games, and that's because you have to sell that as well.
But can you name like one RPG
what you played, but maybe just one major decision of one of the RPGs you played throughout the story, and how that choice impacted the story in a way where you felt very emotional about it and it connected to you in a very large way.
Oh God, no. Sorry. This is what happens when I'm at home.
Yeah, it's
There was also a moment in Mass Effect 3, because I mostly play Paragon. I try to be a good person in all things. But there was a moment with the Quarian general when he like issued that order to attack, and then you see him, and then there's the renegade option, just punch him in the gut. And I took that because I was like, you asshole! And I was like, we were trying so hard.
Did you also punch the reporter in every 3 games?
I've had enough of your snide insinuations.
I did not. I did not punch the reporter.
I don't know, maybe it's an RPG. It's Detroit Becomes Human.
Oh.
Okay, so Detroit Becomes Human. You have 6 characters, and how you steer their world and how you influence what happens around them will depend on who they are and how they turn out and how the world turns out. I played that game through the first time, and I invested a lot of time in each of the characters, and they were all alive to the second to last scene. And I ended up, through a couple of decisions I made, they all ended up dead by the end of the game, which I've never played a game like that before, that has ended up with all my characters dying and still the game ending. And it gave an incredible sense of importance to those characters, and I felt real loss when those characters had gone. And I think that's the future. The future is where you can engage the audience, the players, so much that they actually care and have emotional attachment to the characters. Then I think you've won, and I think that's the future.
Puts up a mirror to you and says, okay, this is who you are, this is what you did. And you kind of, when you looked at that and you're like, oh, this is like, did you feel like, oh, I made these choices because I wanted to see what happened, or like these were like gut reaction choices you made, and it was kind of like looking at yourself in the mirror when put into this world, you're like, oh my God, this is who I am.
There are some people who want to play as multiple characters, just to experiment. But, for those people who feel individualistic and may associate themselves with this one persona, this one unique persona that they became heavily invested into, it can be hard for the likes of me just to go for a second playthrough, just because I'm not going to get to the same magic, and also because I fear that the story is not going to be as flexible as I would have liked. Because in games, we like to think that the branching narratives, they're going to branch endlessly, but that's just going to require a lot of resources and time to create those different branches.
That's this whole idea of like the smaller choices are the things that are more interpersonal, where these big choices like, oh, they're affecting the world, but there's small choices like, oh,
right. And when I mention interpersonal choices, that's important because in a PC Gamer article that was published 2 years ago, a lot of people brought into consideration the fact that a lot of RPGs are focused on end-of-world scenarios and chosen one narratives that have been overused over time. And some RPG developers and writers are thinking of taking things a bit more intimately and trying to scale things back in order to focus more on the characters rather than the events themselves.
With the advances in technology and stuff like that, do you think that idea that there will be multiple branching, so much more branching with advances in technology, and how do you think technology will advance the narrative development of RPGs and storytelling and stuff like that?
How it's going to advance it. Games are always going to be reliant upon the technology that they are built on. Now, in terms of narrative, I mentioned the likes of the Middle-earth games. Now, there's a lot of procedural elements in that because of the way the character, the player can approach particular orcs, how to tackle them. This is a game in which dying can be kind of a choice, because when you die, there are consequences for the choice that you have made by falling into battle. Like you may not be willing to die in a battle, but if you were to die, then you would see that orc rise through the ranks, and basically they will take into account all of the tricks that you have used in combat, and they will become wiser and also more powerful as a result. Now, that's an example of procedural narrative. You first start with the characters, the enemies. That can create multiple possibilities, multiple narrative possibilities that can result from the interaction of multiple systems. And systems, I think, is what's going to create more narrative branches, like non-traditional branches, as in, oh, hold up, I gotta stop the game because you are at this critical part in the story where you have to make 2 or 3 choices, like in Mass Effect 3, where you have to select between what's your favorite color? Green. Congratulations, you've unlocked the green. Just the cinematic changes colors.
And I think what's starting to happen now is artificial intelligence is starting to come into games. Artificial intelligence is going to get better and better. At the moment, artificial intelligence is embedded in a lot of the most modern days, and it's there to learn. It's to learn about character, about players, and how they play and how they react. And it's sitting in the background now, doing a process called deep learning. And millions of us are all programming this AI how we play, right? Even the unpredictable can be predicted, and AI will start doing that. So your characters will start, when you say penguin, they'll go, what? And they'll start reacting to those things.
I think there's always this pipe dream, especially in games, of going as procedural as possible. We want to create deep learning machines that can act like an NPC so that we can create, like the big companies are trying to create more and more and more content to these games that'll take you 90 plus hours to finish. And they want, in order to create all of that, they can't have humans make all of it. So the idea is you create a machine that can mimic a person, and then you can create dialogue choices and relationship building based on deep learning. I think that is still very far off. I think that we're seeing, like in stuff like Mass Effect Andromeda, where it was originally scaled to be procedural, but then they're like, oh, the tech isn't there, scale it back down. It's very speculative right now. But I think that we're pushing towards trying to recreate human relationships with machines. The problem is machines aren't quite there yet, and there's a lot of nuance that we lose when we're trying to quantify human emotion, human expression. If we're trying to do a motion capture session, for example, and you want to capture every little muscle in someone's face, the closer we get to making it look like a person, the more our brains go, no, I don't like this, because it's not clear messaging. We don't see the world in perfect vision. And the same goes for interaction and conversation and human expression. We don't see everything perfectly, but we're creating machines that create perfect interactions, perfect people. And until we can create something that's a little more flawed and a little bit more indicative of our own experience with the world, with our flawed brains and our flawed hearing and our flawed eyesight, I think it'll still feel very uncanny. But in order to recreate a human experience, it can't be perfect. It can't be a perfect human, because there is no such thing as a perfect human.
Is there anything else you want to talk about on the subject of RPG narratives and storytellings that you don't think I really asked you about or covered or now?
I think the one thing I want to mention is the synergy between gameplay and narratives. And by that I mean, because games are an interactive medium, there shouldn't be a discrepancy or a hard line between gameplay and narrative. They should never be separate.
I think, the basic tagline is just narrative design in games is a dialogue. It's a dialogue between the player and the author, and you have to keep that channel open for it to feel organic.
Video games won't be designed by computers, but computers will make suggestions of what the players want. But that also changes. It changes, how long will we be playing Fortnite for before something else comes along. I think everyone knows that that's going to happen. It always has happened. There's never been a game ever that has always stayed at the top. There's never been a film ever, a book ever. There are some classics that we go back to, but there's always some new kid on the block.
In conclusion, RPG video games that allow for player choice and narrative decisions have a lot of interesting factors that go into it. Whether it be the characters that we make and meet along the way in our adventure, or the amount of systems put into the coding of the game that add to the story itself, or if it's just the writing and the overall narrative and how it's written so that the player can impact it. In the end, there is no question that this type of storytelling is changing the way we tell stories in new and exciting ways. But the question really remains is that, where will we find ourselves in the next 20 years? What new innovations to this format will come with new systems and AI? Only time will tell. I'm Connor Callahan, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation.